The laughter was cruel, echoing through the steel beams of the half-lit warehouse, each sound bouncing off the walls like a taunt. One of the men grabbed at her sleeve. Another shoved her from behind, and before she could catch her balance, their hands were on her waist, tugging at her work shirt, while jeers filled the air. In that moment, the world seemed to collapse into humiliation. Her breath caught. Her pride fractured, but deep in her chest, something hotter than shame began to rise. Her name was Angela Ramirez, 32 years old. A welder who had grown up in Detroit with calloused palms and a heart that never asked for pity. She had spent years fighting to prove she belonged in a line of work where sweat, grit, and steel were considered a man's territory. The factory floor had been her proving ground, and the heavy tools in her belt were as familiar to her as the keys to her small apartment. But none of that hardened exterior prepared her for the ugliness that came not from molten sparks, but from men who believed they had the right to toy with her body. The conflict had started small, a whistle here, a smirk there. She ignored it at first, telling herself that keeping her head down was the fastest way to make it through her shift. But harassment, like rust, spreads quietly until it weakens everything it touches. What began as words became brushes of the shoulder, lingering stares and comments whispered just loud enough for her to hear. Then, on that late Thursday evening, when overtime had thinned the crew to a skeleton shift, the group of bullies decided they had a captive audience. They didn't care that Angela was exhausted from 12 hours of labor. They cared only that she looked cornered, her safety stripped away by the numbers they held over her. The humiliation burned. Their laughter clawed at her pride, each sound dragging her deeper into the pit of shame they dug around her. But behind her clenched teeth and stiffened spine, a dangerous thought was taking shape. She would not let this continue. She would not let their hands and their sneers write the story of who she was. Angela's father, a retired mechanic who raised her after her mother's passing, had taught her more than just how to repair broken engines. He had taught her never to back down from a fight that truly mattered. Dignity, he used to say, wiping grease from his brow, isn't something you beg for. It's something you defend. She remembered those words now, even as her fists trembled and her heart hammered against her ribs. She might not have the size or the numbers, but she had the will, and in the corner of the shop lay the tool that could even the odds. She locked eyes with the tallest of the bullies as he tightened his grip on her arm, mocking her silence. To him, she looked powerless. To her, he looked like the reason she would never again stay silent. That flicker of determination was small, nearly invisible, beneath the weight of their taunts, but it was there, igniting something unstoppable inside her. In the shadows of the shop floor, where sparks from welding torches had long since died, Angela made a silent promise to herself. Tonight would not end with her walking home in tears, broken by the memory of their hands. Tonight would end differently. They thought she was cornered. They thought she was weak. But they hadn't seen her yet. Not the part of her forged in fire, sharpened by hardship, and ready to swing with the weight of steel. The wrench waited for her, heavy and cold, just a few feet away. And so did her revenge. Angela sat in the locker room long after the laughter of the bullies faded, her hands shaking as she stared at the cracked tile floor. The humiliation gnawed at her, but more than that, the silence she had maintained made her stomach twist with self-loathing. She had done nothing, just stood there rigid, praying the moment would pass. And while they walked away, still laughing, she felt as though she had let them take something from her that no one had the right to touch. Her reflection in this mirror across the room seemed almost foreign. Stray strands of black hair clung to her sweat-streaked face, her brown eyes red with unshed tears. For a fleeting second, she thought about quitting. walking away, finding a quieter job where she didn't have to fight every day to prove she belonged. But then, like a whisper from the past, she heard her father's voice again. Dignity isn't given, Angie. It's defended. Once you let someone take it, they'll never stop. She slammed her fist against the locker door, the metallic clang echoing like a war drum. Fear was still there, curling in her gut, but now it was wrapped in something sharper. Anger. She thought back to her younger years in Detroit, when she had to protect herself from kids on the block who thought they could push her around because she was small. She had survived those days by learning how to fight smart, by realizing that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The factory was her battleground now, and these men thought they owned it. They mistook her silence for weakness, her focus for submission. But Angela had endured worse than their leering stares and crude touches. She had survived losing her mother at 15, holding 2 part-time jobs while finishing high school, keeping the roof over her and her father's head when his bad back left him out of work. She was not fragile. She was not prey. As she laced her steel-toed boots and pulled on her work gloves again, Angela felt her heartbeat steady. The next time they cornered her, things would not play out the same. She would not cower. She would not tremble. She would have something in her hands besides fear. Her gaze drifted toward her toolbox in the corner, dented old but still reliable. Inside lay wrenches, hammers, pliers, tools she knew better than the lines of her own palms. They had built her livelihood, carved out her independence, and now they would protect her dignity. The following day, she moved through her shift with mechanical precision, her every action fueled by simmering resolve. Sparks flew from her welding torch, showering the concrete like fiery rain, but her mind was elsewhere. She was waiting, watching, listening for the telltale sound of their boots scuffing the concrete, for the voices that carried mockery with every syllable. She knew they would come. Bullies always came back when they believed their target had nowhere else to go. And when they did, Angela would be ready. The thought alone steadied her nerves, replacing her shame with anticipation. She could almost feel the weight of the wrench in her hand, already the cold metal an extension of her fury. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about drawing a line they could never cross again. That evening, as the crew dwindled and the shadows lengthened across the warehouse floor, Angela's heart thudded with grim certainty. The bullies would not let her pass unnoticed. They would come looking for entertainment. And this time, they would discover that the woman they thought of as their victim had found her breaking point. Her knuckles brushed against the wrench, resting in her back pocket, hidden but ready. She had chosen her weapon, and more importantly, she had chosen her resolve. The clang of steel doors closing behind the last departing workers echoed through the cavernous factory. Angela remained at her station, head bent, as if absorbed in her final tasks of the evening. In reality, her ears were tuned to every sound, her body tense with anticipation. The air smelled of oil and metal, the hum of machinery fading into silence as the building emptied. She knew what was coming. She felt it like a storm pressing down on the horizon. Then came the sound she had been waiting for, their voices. Low at first, then growing louder as they swaggered down the aisle between workbenches. Laughter rolled off the walls, carrying the same ugly edge that had burned her the night before. Her stomach tightened, but her hand brushed against the heavy wrench tucked into her waistband. Just the feel of the tool steadied her, reminded her that this time she wasn't defenseless. "Look who's working late again, the tallest of them," jeered his boots, stomping deliberately against the floor. All alone. "Didn't you learn your lesson yesterday?" Angela kept her eyes on her welding mask, sliding it off slowly, as if the taunts barely registered. Inside, her pulse pounded so hard she thought they might hear it. But on the outside, she was calm, too calm. Her silence unsettled them, though they masked it with smirks and whistles. Another man stepped forward, his grin wide and mocking. "Come on, Angie, don't be shy. We just came to keep you company." His hand twitched toward her arm, the same as before, daring her to flinch. But Angela didn't flinch. Instead, she stood up straight, her boots scraping against the concrete, her shoulders squared. Her right hand slipped behind her back, fingers curling around the cool steel of the wrench. The weight of it felt good, reassuring, powerful. She had swung tools heavier than this thousands of times. She knew their balance, their force. This was no different, only the target had changed. "Back off," she said, her voice steady and low, the kind of voice that carried an edge sharp enough to cut through bravado. The group erupted in laughter. Or what one sneered, "You gonna cry on us again?" Angela's jaw tightened. She took one slow step forward, the wrench hidden but ready. The leader, emboldened by his buddy's laughter, reached out again, this time brushing his fingers against the collar of her shirt. The contact was the spark to dry kindling, the final insult, the line they should never have crossed. In one fluid motion, Angela pulled the wrench from behind her back. The metallic scrape against her tool belt silenced the laughter instantly. She gripped it tight, lifting it with a confidence that sent a chill through the room. Her stance wasn't wild or frantic. It was grounded. Measured the stance of someone who had spent years lifting and swinging heavy tools with precision. "You touch me again," she said. Her eyes locked on his, and you'll find out exactly what this wrench can do. For a heartbeat, the room froze. The bullies stared at her, expecting hesitation, expecting her to falter. But Angela didn't falter. She raised the wrench slightly, the steel gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights, and took another deliberate step toward them. The smirk on the lighter's face faltered. His buddies exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado slipping from their expressions. They had expected fear. What they got was fire, and it scared them more than they could admit. The wrench had become more than a tool. In her hands, it was a declaration, a promise that she would never again stand silent while they stripped her of dignity. And as she advanced, eyes blazing, the bullies realized for the first time that they might be the ones in danger. The leader tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked halfway out of his throat, brittle and unconvincing. Angela's grip tightened on the wrench, the steel glinting in the fluorescent light as she leveled it at his chest. Every ounce of anger, humiliation, and defiance in her body surged through her arm. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. The predator now tasted what it meant to be prey. "Put that down, sweetheart." One of the others muttered, his voice softer now, laced with unease. He raised his palms as if placating a wild animal. But Angela didn't budge. She took another deliberate step forward, her boots striking the floor with a heavy, purposeful thud. The leader forced a sneer, desperate to regain control. "What, you think you're scary now? You don't have the guts." He lunged forward, fingers snatching for her wrist. But he underestimated her resolve and her swing. The wrench cut through the air with a whistle before colliding with his forearm. The sound was sharp, a sickening crack echoing through the factory. The man howled, stumbling backward, clutching his arm as his buddies froze in shock. Angela didn't pause. She pivoted, driving her shoulder forward, brandishing the wrench like a soldier holding the line. "You wanted to see what I'm made of," she shouted, her voice shaking but louder than it had ever been. "Here it is." Another rushed her from the side, his teeth bared in panic more than aggression. Angela swung again, this time, connecting with the metal table at her side, the clang reverberating like a thunderclap. Sparks of terror flashed across his face as he skidded to a halt, hands raised. Her stance was wide balanced, her chest heaving with adrenaline, but her eyes never wavered. For years, she had carried tools as extensions of herself, forging her livelihood from steel and fire. Tonight, that same steel forged her defense. Her movements weren't wild, but precise. Every swing measured, every step forward deliberate. The wrench was not just a weapon, it was a statement. She was done being their victim. The injured leader cursed through clenched teeth, backing toward the exit while still cradling his arm. His arrogance had been shattered along with his bone. "She's crazy," he spat, his bravado dissolving into pain. "Crazy enough to fight back," Angela replied, her voice cold and steady. The other men hovered uncertainly, their faces pale. The courage they once borrowed from numbers had evaporated. Without their leader's swagger to shield them, they were exposed for what they really were, cowards. And in the silence that followed their fear was louder than any insult they had thrown at her before. Angela advanced one final step. The wrench raised her breath, ragged, but her eyes steady. "Go," she commanded, her voice firm as stone. "Go, before you find out how far I'll take this." They didn't argue. They didn't mock. They didn't even look her in the eye. One by one, they turned and bolted for the exit. Boots pounding the concrete, scrambling like rats from a sinking ship. The leader stumbled after them, his curses fading into the night. When the doors slammed shut, the silence that filled the factory was absolute. Angela lowered the wrench, her arms trembling now that the surge of adrenaline was ebbing. Sweat soaked her shirt, her body shaking not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she had done. For the first time since stepping into that factory months ago, she stood not as a target, not as a woman forced to endure, but as someone who had claimed her dignity back with her own two hands. The wrench hung heavy at her side, but in her heart it felt weightless, a symbol of her refusal to ever be broken again. Angela leaned against the workbench, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts, the wrench still gripped tight in her hand. Her palms were slick with sweat, her arms trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline, but her gaze remained fixed on the empty doorway where the bullies had fled. For a moment, she couldn't quite believe it, they were gone. The same men who had mocked her, pawed at her, reduced her to silence, were now the ones running in fear. The stillness of the factory wrapped around her like a blanket. Machines stood quiet shadows, stretched long across the floor, and the air held the faint tang of oil and metal. Slowly, Angela placed the wrench on the bench. The sound of steel against steel rang sharp final, like the punctuation at the end of a sentence she had been writing for months. Her knees buckled slightly, the weight of everything crashing into her at once. She remembered the jeers, the hands, the suffocating humiliation, and then the moment she refused to stay silent. She replayed the strike in her mind, the crack of bone, the shock etched on their faces. For the first time in her life, she had witnessed their fear instead of feeling her own. And though she had always considered herself strong tonight, she realized strength wasn't just about enduring, it was about drawing the line where no one dared cross. Angela cleaned up slowly, each motion deliberate. She tucked the wrench back into her toolbox, wiping it down as if it were any other tool after a long day. But in her heart, it was no longer just a wrench. It was a symbol, a reminder that she had stood her ground when it mattered most. The next day, the factory buzzed with whispers. Word traveled fast, faster than sparks on steel. The bullies came in late, their arrogance stripped away, their movements subdued. The leader's arm was strapped tight in a splint, his jaw clenched whenever eyes landed on him. No one dared laugh. No one dared look at Angela the same way again. She walked through the factory with her head high, shoulders square, each step steady. She didn't gloat, didn't smile triumphantly. She simply carried herself with the dignity she had fought for, the dignity no one could steal again. The silence that followed her wasn't hostile anymore. It was respect unspoken, but unmistakable. That evening, Angela returned home to her small apartment, collapsing onto the worn couch with a weary sigh. Her father sat in his recliner, his old hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He studied her quietly, his sharp eyes catching the exhaustion etched into her features. "Tough day?" he asked. Angela met his gaze, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "Tough, yeah. But I think I finally learned what you meant. About dignity," he said, voice low but proud. She nodded. "It's not something you ask for. It's something you fight for." Her father leaned back, the ghost of a smile on his weathered face. "That's my girl." As night settled over the city, Angela felt a peace she hadn't known in months. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, she knew she wouldn't face them as a victim, but as someone who had found her voice, her courage, and her strength, all forged in the fire of defiance. The bullies might have walked away nursing wounds, but she walked away with something far greater, her freedom. Life has a way of testing dignity, often through those who seek to tear it down. Angela's story is a reminder that silence in the face of cruelty only feeds the bully's power. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, to defend what is rightfully yours. We may not always have size or numbers on our side, but we all hold a wrench within us, the strength to stand up, fight back, and reclaim our worth. When dignity is defended, fear loses its grip, and respect becomes undeniable.